Good afternoon, all. I'm John Merrifield, the CEO of the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment. Today's webinar will describe and discuss a key element of the absolutely unromantic politics of K through 12 funding and governance, the public education establishment, and pointedly the National Education Association, better known by its initials, the NEA, has a long history of fighting to sustain and reinforce K through 12 captivity. Our partner, the Center for K through 12 Captivity Studies, headed by Martha Bradley Dorsey, will introduce our presenter, a legal scholar and NEA expert.
Thank you, John. And we have to send out a big welcome to Michael Bendis for being here. And thanks to all of you for listening, because Michael is quite the expert on litigating in terms of school choice. Right now, and for the last 20 years, he's been a senior attorney with the Institute for Justice. He leads IJ's educational choice team, and in this role, he oversees a number of attorneys who help find ways to defend educational choice programs in ways that will succeed. He argued, for example, for the Carson and Nelson families in the Carson v. Macon court case in Maine. He has argued as well in the Espinosa versus Montana Department of Revenue case. We both know that these are really important cases. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. Just before I do that, I'm going to say I'll be asking a few questions when you're finished with your presentation. And then once I get my questions asked, then we'll turn it over to others to see what they have to ask.
Great. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, John. I'd like to talk today about kind of the role of what I call the public education establishment in opposing educational opportunity for students outside of the public school system. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the historic role of private educational effort in this country. Then talk about the rise of the public education system and again, what I call the public education establishment in the mid-19th century, and really focus on how the rise of that movement was coupled with an overt hostility of public school proponents to any private educational endeavors that competed with that public school system. And I'll wrap up by talking about what the results of that war on private education have been. I think that that war has not gone well for the public education establishment for reasons that I'll talk about. But I'll start with a brief history of the role of private education in this country. When our nation was founded in the early republic, there really was no public education system to speak of. Virtually all educational efforts were conducted by private educators, private schooling, often through efforts by missionaries and churches. And oftentimes these efforts were directly supported financially by government at all levels, federal, local, and state. So, for example, as early as 1795, we see the New York legislature passing a law that appropriates money to cities throughout the state for the purpose of securing schooling for children in the state. And it directs in 1795, for example, the New York City Board of Aldermen, I believe they were called, to divide up these monies among the so-called charity schools of the city, which were, with one exception, so far as I can tell, all church-run, affiliated with various Protestant denominations. Again, ordered that the money be divided among these schools so that they could provide education for indigent families, including specifically Black and Indian families. And as the citizenry of New York became more diverse in the coming years, the availability of these funds expanded to other denominations. So, like I said, originally it was Protestant denominations, but by 1806, we see at least one Catholic school receiving funding through this program. And by 1811, even a Jewish school being funded. So And that's just one instance. In 1802, the Pennsylvania legislature enacted what Professor Mark Storsley has called the nation's first voucher program, where the state again directed municipalities to raise taxes for educational purposes, and then directed those municipalities to distribute those monies to the school of a parent's choosing. And again, this was at a time when virtually all schooling was privately run. So you see early on in the Republic, private educators, often with government funding, providing really the only educational opportunity in the country. Fast forward a few decades, focusing on education for Black students in particular, it was private schools, again, often religious-oriented schools, providing educational opportunity for free Blacks in the North. You have, African American religious leaders, the African Methodist Church, setting up a lot of schools, particularly in Baltimore. Baltimore seems to have been a hotbed for education for free Blacks. You have an order of Black religious sisters, a Catholic order, setting up schools in Baltimore and later throughout the country, some of which continue to operate to this day. And even in the South, you see missionaries going down in the antebellum period and providing not schools per se, but education, literacy training for children of enslaved Black people as well, at least until it became illegal to do so, right? In response to some of the preaching of folks like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, Southern states begin criminalizing the practice of teaching Blacks to read in the South. But even then, some of these missionaries defied those directives and continued to teach the children of enslaved people. And then, of course, in the wake of the Civil War, you see missionaries going back to the South, setting up schools with direct financial support from the Freedmen's Bureau, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau, and setting up schools for the children of the now freedmen. And many of those schools became the historically Black colleges and universities that continue to operate to this day. So it was really during this early period in our country through the Civil War, it was private educators, private schools, often religiously led efforts that were providing the only real meaningful educational opportunity for children in the country, particularly minority children and lower income children. And in fact, one of the purposes of the 14th Amendment was to provide a sound constitutional basis for government to support these efforts. When the Freedmen's Bureau bill was up for reauthorization, President Johnson vetoed it twice, in part because he had constitutional questions about the power of the Freedmen's Bureau to support these educational efforts of these Northern missionary societies. And before Congress overrode the second veto, they enacted the 14th Amendment in part to provide a constitutional basis for the reauthorized Freedmen's Bureau bill, the second Freedmen's Bureau bill. So again, private education was central, almost exclusive in this, in much of this period. Now, of course, as we get into the 19th century and into the middle of the 19th century, we start to see the development of the modern public school system. That also coincides with the rise of what was at first called the National Teachers Association, founded in 1857, but quickly was rebranded the National Educational Association and then the National Education Association. Again, it was founded in 1857, and from the get-go, it was hell-bent on preserving this nascent public school system that was emerging in the country and preventing any competition to that system from these private schools and educators that had been providing opportunity to children all along. And one of the biggest ways they did this, at least in the second half of the 19th century, was through the Blaine movement. I suspect a lot of you are familiar with Blaine amendments. These, generally speaking, are state constitutional provisions that prohibit public funding of religious or sometimes more broadly private schools. And the one of the prime movers in the effort to include these provisions in state constitutions was the National Education Association. In fact, there was initially an effort made to amend the federal constitution to include a provision like this. And when that failed, the attention turned to state constitutions. And we see some 37 state constitutions today that have these provisions. And again, the NEA was one of the big kind of prime movers in this effort. Now, to be clear, the NEA was not against religious schooling, far from it. In 1866, for example, so right after the war, the NEA called for public schools to, quote, train the young to be religious, instilling in them a spirit of devotion and faith in the most important truths of our holy religion. Of course, that was the Protestant religion. That was the religion of the large majority of the country at the time. And there were numerous accounts of Catholic school children and other religious minorities who were beaten or expelled from public schools for refusing to engage in Protestant religious exercises in those public schools. And there are judicial opinions upholding these beatings and expulsions. You can find accounts of students like Bridget Donahoe, Tom Wall, Mary and John Hahir, all who suffered in public schools for refusing to engage in these Protestant religious exercises. So in light of these experiences in the public schools, Catholics begin lobbying for better treatment, and when that doesn't work, they begin lobbying for a share of public school of the school funds so that they can set up their own schools. And that goes over like a lead balloon. The NEA and its cronies seize on kind of anti-Catholic animus, try to amend the federal constitution, as I mentioned, to include one of these Blaine provisions, and when that fails, turn their attention to state constitutions. And their reasoning for doing this was very clear. It was to preserve their monopoly on education, the monopoly they were beginning to develop, and to ensure that that all children were made proper Americans through the public school system. And this isn't just my categorization. In 1891, the NEA's Committee on State School Systems issued a report that I'll quote a little bit from here, but said, "Foreign influence has begun a system of colonization with a purpose of preserving foreign languages and traditions and proportionately of destroying distinctive Americanism. These foreigners," the committee warned, "are among us in large and influential numbers, who refuse to send to the public schools, who insist upon the exclusive control and direction of the education of their children." Why do they do it? The NEA committee asked. The answer is simply this: they are foreigners. They have come unavoidably, bringing their customs, habits, attachments, and traditions of another land, and all in a tongue which is the channel of every thought, feeling, and religious sentiment. And the remedy, the committee concluded, is the assimilating power of a public free school system. So from the outset, the NEA was, again, as I put it before, hell-bent on ensuring that they were the only game in town. This public school system that they were now establishing was the only game in town because they needed to make good Americans of these foreigners, these unwashed masses, as the NEA would put it. And they thought that the only way to do that was, again, the assimilating power of the public school system. So at the outset, the public school establishment, the NEA, was all about depriving any opportunity outside of that system in order to maintain a monopoly and make good Americans in their view of students. Now, that opposition to private educational opportunity continued into the 20th century. In time, the focus turned away, not so much from opposition or hostility to Catholics and other religious minorities, but often to educational opportunity for Blacks as well. And the NEA, in fact, in order to establish itself as a national organization, accommodated the views of Southerners and the views of the proper role of education with respect to Black citizens in the South. In fact, by the 1880s, it had elected as its president the former Georgia superintendent of public education, who purported to speak as the authority on the proper way to educate the Negro child. And that meant not only segregated public schooling for those children, but also, again, interference with the ability of private educators to provide any alternatives to Black children. There's a particularly egregious example of this in Florida. At the urging of the state superintendent of public instruction, the legislature passed a law that criminalized white teachers teaching Black students. And the day after Easter in 1916, 3 Catholic nuns were arrested for the crime of teaching Black children. So again, that's just one example of many of the NEA, its cronies, in this case, the superintendent of public instruction in the state, doing everything they could to prevent private educators from providing opportunity, especially to poor and minority students. Fast forward another decade or two, and you have these language laws in the 1920s. In the wake of the First World War, there was great anti-German animus in the country, and the NEA began advocating for what were called language laws that prohibited the teaching in any language other than English in not just the public school system, but the private schools as well. In 1919, the NEA adopted a resolution that called for, number one, the legal provision for the use of English as the language of instruction in all schools, as well as, number two, legal provision for compulsory classes in Americanization for all illiterates and all who are not able to read and write the English language with a proficiency equivalent to a 6th grade standard, which standard shall be necessary for admission to citizenship to the United States. That's the National Education Association saying that. That isn't something that is coming up in the context of immigration today. Now, these laws didn't just require that schools teach in English. Schools were teaching in English. These laws took the extra step of saying, and you cannot provide classes in any other language. So Nebraska, for example, was one of many states that passed these laws. Its law provided that no person, individually or as a teacher, shall in any private, denominational, parochial, or public school teach any subject to any person in any language other than the English language. It was a misdemeanor punishable by $100 and 30 days in jail. And these laws, again, were fueled by animus. This time it wasn't necessarily Catholics, although that did play a part. It wasn't Black children. Now it was anti-German animus in the wake of the war. These laws were directed first and foremost toward Lutheran schools that were often conducted or offered classes in, not necessarily conducted, but offered classes in German and Scandinavian languages, but as well as Catholic schools, which oftentimes had ethnic parishes and schools associated with them to provide education for immigrants increasingly from Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Italy, etc. And then just a couple of years later, the NEA plays a prime role, and state public teachers associations play a prime role in trying to enact laws to compel every child in the country to attend public schools, not just to compel students to attend a school. This isn't a compulsory attendance law like we have today. These were laws forcing all children to attend public schools only. There was an effort in many states to adopt these provisions. Thankfully, the only one that actually passed was in Oregon. And like the Blaine movement and like the language law movement before it, this compulsory public education movement was rooted squarely in anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic animus. And the Oregon effort was supported very vocally by the Oregon Education Association in 1922, which around the same time also endorsed a campaign that called for loyalty oaths as well. So the NEA trumpeted the passage of this law in 1922 in Oregon as the most significant educational achievement in the state in 1922. So again, continued war on any kind of private alternative to the public school system. Fast forward to today, where we see that continue to play out, right? Over the last 30 years, beginning in 1990 in Wisconsin, we see the birth of the modern school choice movement, providing alternatives to children for whom the public school system is just not the best fit. And from the inception of that movement, the public school establishment, so the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, National School Boards Associations, et cetera, have done everything they can to take the opportunities that these programs provide students away from those students, including by spearheading much of the litigation challenging these programs. And in kind of coming full circle, most of their litigation efforts have harkened back to those Blaine amendments that they helped secure in the 19th century. They've been weaponizing these Blaine amendments to attack school choice programs, to try to either shut down the programs entirely or at least exclude religious schools from these programs. So again, this is just the most kind of recent example of what has been a constant battle waged against private educational alternatives to the public school system ever since the birth of that system and of the National Education Association. So how have these efforts fared? Has the public school establishment achieved what they sought to achieve in combating all of these private educational endeavors? Let's take a look. Remember that Florida law that I mentioned, under which those 3 Catholic nuns were prosecuted for the crime of teaching Black children. Thankfully, they were acquitted of that charge in an opinion by a trial court judge in Florida who actually held that that law was unconstitutional as applied to private schools. And it's a wonderful opinion. Typically, you don't get super excited about trial court opinions, but this one I think was really prescient of some Supreme Court opinions that we would see just a decade later. The court really focused on the right of private educators, in this case those nuns, to offer their services to children, including Black children. And the court asked, has a white teacher any the less right to sell his services to Negro pupils than a white doctor to Negro patients? Such a law amounts to class legislation depriving teachers of privileges which are not denied to any other class of citizens, and it violates the right of a citizen to be free in the enjoyment of all his faculties and to be free in the use of them in all lawful ways when they do not infringe upon the equal rights of others. So an express protection for the right of private educators to provide their services to whatever students seek those services from them. So an example of the public school establishment's efforts backfiring on them and resulting in judicial precedent that protects the right of private schools. How about those language laws in the 1920s? Remember, I discussed Nebraska's law. There was a gentleman named Robert Meyer who was prosecuted under that law. Robert Meyer was a teacher. His crime that he was charged with was reading Bible passages in German to children in a Lutheran school. He was prosecuted. He was convicted under Nebraska's language law. And thankfully, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923 held that that law was unconstitutional under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. More specifically, the court protected the right of Robert Meyer to teach, to offer his services. It protected, quote, the right of parents to engage him, so to instruct their children. And again, I'm quoting, the power of parents to control the education of their own. So again, the NEA, the public school establishment's efforts backfire, resulting in this case, national precedent from the U.S. Supreme Court recognizing the right of private schools to offer their services and the right of parents to control the education of their own, as the court put it. How about that compulsory public school attendance law in Oregon? Supreme Court held that unconstitutional as well in 1925 in Pierce versus Society of Sisters. In fact, we'll celebrate the centennial of that decision in just a couple of weeks here. And the court, again, held Oregon's compulsory public school attendance law unconstitutional, relying in large part on the Meyer decision from just a couple of years earlier. And the court's opinion recognized, number one, and I'm quoting, the child is not the mere creature of the state. It recognized that parents have a constitutional right to direct the upbringing and education of children under their control. And the court said that the fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. So again, the NEA, the public school establishment's campaign against private educational options, backfires magnificently. How about those attacks on modern school choice programs that we've been fighting against for the last 3 decades? Those have backfired as well, right? The public school establishment reached back to those Blaine amendments that they secured back in the late 1800s, tried to weaponize them to attack and take away private educational alternatives. And we get a trio of U.S. Supreme Court decisions rejecting those efforts. Number one, we get Zellman versus Simmons-Harris in 2002, in which the court said that religious schools are free to participate in these programs, and that doing so does not violate the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And then in 2020 and 2022, we get Espinoza and Carson, in which the court holds not only is it permissible for religious schools to participate, it is impermissible to exclude them from participating, because to do so would violate the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. So again, at every turn, the campaign waged by the public school establishment to take away educational opportunities, educational alternatives to the public school system has backfired spectacularly. And it has secured this arc that bends consistently toward greater protection for the right of parents to direct the education of their children and the right of private educators to provide their services to children if their parents so desire them. So I would say thank you, NEA and public school establishment, for your hostility and for the great precedent that it has created, even if it wasn't what you all intended. And it just shows that the more that they do to block opportunity, the greater protection we see resulting for the rights of students, parents, and private educators. And you would think that they would learn their lesson by now after a century and a half of these outcomes, but no, they have not learned their lesson, nor have they learned the lesson why so many children, particularly poor minority children, want alternatives to the public school system. And that is because it's the public school system itself that is perpetuating the conditions that prompt so many of those students to want alternatives. It's the public school system that is often resulting in segregation along racial, ethnic, socioeconomic lines. And it's that segregation that families desperately want to escape. And they've primarily done this. The public school has primarily perpetuated this kind of sorting along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines through, first and foremost, the process of residential assignment. 80% roughly of students in this country attend a school that they are assigned to by the government based on nothing more than their home address, which is simply a proxy for wealth. If you can afford to live in a wealthy school district or an attendance zone that has a great public school, good for you. If you live in a poor neighborhood with lousy public schools, too bad for you. That's what you get. By maintaining this kind of residence-based assignment scheme, which so often traps the most vulnerable children in the worst performing schools, the public school establishment is harming the very children that it purports to serve. And it's, again, no wonder why so many families are demanding alternatives to that system. And so long as the public school establishment continues to oppose those alternatives, to wage a war against those alternatives, I am convinced that we will continue to see that arc of precedent bend ever more toward greater protection for the rights of children to secure alternatives to the public system, the right of parents to direct the education of their children, and the right of private educators, private schools to provide services that these families so desperately want. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
I have to say thank you so much for your inspiring work and the comments that you made today, because there are so many kids who need different schooling than they have. So thank you very much, Michael. I think my first question that I have, based on what you summarized through your presentation, and especially at the end, is all the work that you have done so far has been to defend school choice efforts in various states. Do you think it's time to go on the offense and start attacking at a maybe across state lines level?
I would love to see that. You're right, Martha. Our efforts have been focused on securing legislatively adopted school choice programs, and then defending those programs in court when they're challenged. And over the last couple of years, we've had the pleasure to do that increasingly with the good folks at EdChoice. I see Tom Fisher is on the call as well. That has been our focus for the last 30 years. It would be wonderful to see a shift from not just securing passage of these programs and defending them when challenged, but to, as you put it, going on the offensive, to use the law to protect the right of parents in a more meaningful way, that enables them to secure opportunities outside of the public system if that's not the best fit for them. The issue I see in that shift in strategy is identifying the right legal theory, and that's always been a challenge. There's a lot of discussion about whether the time is right to develop that strategy, to shift from the kind of defensive to the offensive posture, and that's it. That's just, I think, of the trick is identifying that legal theory that is both kind of logically correct, but also something that courts are going to be willing to embrace. I think we're closer to that now, in large part because of many of the decisions that I mentioned in the course of my presentation. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch a couple of the cases that the Supreme Court decides this term, including the Mahmoud versus Taylor case, in which parents were denied an opt-out from certain aspects of the public school curriculum that they didn't want their children exposed to. It will be really interesting to see what the Supreme Court holds in that case, and on what grounds it rests its holding. And that could perhaps provide kind of an entryway for some of the types of litigation that you're talking about. But I think that's really the trick. And I wish I had some kind of great insight on what that, fail-safe kind of legal theory is. And I just have not come across it yet.
It's whatever it is, I think it's saying many thanks to the efforts of your organization and some of those that preceded you to get us to where we are now, to have established that those folks are not seen as being right. And so once again, kudos to you. I really appreciate that. You had mentioned one of the purposes of the 14th Amendment way back in I guess just postbellum, maybe, which was to provide a constitutional basis for the federal government's support of private, largely religious schools to educate the freedmen during Reconstruction. You said in that statement, and I pulled this out because of the last question I asked you, you said, since the stated purpose was largely related to religious schools, is there any way that this could be viewed as a broadening of the reach of any 14th Amendment-based litigation to free students to use public funding for private schooling or for public schooling in another attendance area or district?
I certainly don't think that to the extent the 14th Amendment history is relevant, that it's only relevant to religious schools. I
Okay.
think it was to the extent the 14th Amendment was constitutionalizing the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau, it was not specific to religion. You're right. Most of those efforts were Northern missionaries, religious missionaries coming down to the South and providing educational opportunity. But I don't think that was the sole focus. And I think that to the extent that the history is relevant, it's relevant to all private education. The trick, though, is bridging the gap between providing a constitutional basis for government in its discretion to provide for private educational opportunity, going from that to saying that the 14th Amendment itself mandates that government provide for private educational opportunities. And I think that leap is one that I've not, that I don't have a kind of legal theory for how to get from A to B. Now, there's something in between those things that I think goes to this idea that the 14th Amendment is relevant not just for religious schools, but for non-religious private schools as well. And that is some states have a slight variation on a Blaine Amendment. So the traditional Blaine Amendment, as I mentioned in my discussion, prohibits public funding for religious or sectarian schools. Some states have provisions that speak more broadly to private schools, prohibiting public funding for private schools or private school students. Now, thankfully, most of the states that have these provisions have interpreted them in a way that still allows school choice. They say, well, it doesn't matter if the state constitution says no money to private schools because school choice programs provide scholarships to families, not to schools. That is, I think, a correct interpretation. Some states, a very small handful, have not made that distinction and have said that these provisions prohibit even programs that provide aid to private school students. And I do think that the 14th Amendment has something to say about the constitutionality of those state constitutional provisions. I think it's impermissible for a state to enshrine in its constitution hostility and a wholesale bar on government's ability in its discretion to provide educational opportunities to children whose parents feel that a private school is the best fit for their kids. Under these provisions, the government can fund public schools, it can fund homeschooling, it can fund all manner of other educational options. The one thing it can't do is provide funding that would be used at a private school to pay tuition at a private school. That is a purposeful targeting of one way that parents can fulfill their obligations, their educational obligations with respect to their children. And it singles that one way out for disfavor. And I think that the 14th Amendment does speak to that and does suggest that kind of bar to support for families who exercise their fundamental right, as Pierce recognized, to choose a private school for their children. That is problematic under the 14th Amendment. So I think the 14th Amendment speaks to that. But again, that's my argument with respect to those, what I call public-private Blaine amendments, is really an argument that government cannot single out and target for disfavor parents who choose private schools for their children and the schools that provide that opportunity. That's not the same thing as saying government must provide that opportunity or provide the funding for that opportunity. So again, I have not seen the kind of legal theory that takes you from, simply allowing government to adopt school choice programs or invalidating state constitutional amendments that target religious schooling specifically or private schooling more broadly. I haven't seen the theory that gets you from those types of litigation efforts to government must fund private education. I think that's the leap in the legal theory that I've not seen developed yet.
Okay. So in some of our discussions at the Center for K-12 Captivity Studies, really the direction that I'm pushing for, it sounds simple, but it's not simple. But it is, instead of adding to the patchwork of school choice programs around the nation, which, by the way, only cover maybe 20% of the kids. Instead of doing that, we take away states, plural, states' ability, we'll call that unconstitutional, to capture children in that district of residence or that attendance area of residence school. And now taking that away means the funding has to go with it, or it means nothing, because right now, these people, the reason that they are in these schools is they cannot afford to go to another one. So I don't know, that seems to be like the big question. I would guess that how do you do that?
And that is the question. Intuitively, it's simple and it's logical and it makes all the sense in the world. The issue is the legal theory. What is the legal theory that gets you to that? And I think that is something that folks who are concerned with education reform and providing greater educational opportunity to parents and children are still grappling with and still searching for that legal theory. But I agree intuitively, if government is going to tax you for education, if government is going to compel you to provide an education for your children, you should be allowed to decide how that money you're being taxed with for is spent. What education your child should receive. What's going to best meet her needs. It makes all the sense in the world as a logical, intuitive matter. It's just the legal argument. I just don't know if it's there yet.
Okay, let me just ask one more question, and then I want to turn it over to other folks because I want to hear what other people have to say. But is it possible that you could make an argument because the public school system is complicit in segregation? It is that captivity system is complicit in the segregation that forces children into lower quality schools. Could that be a door opening, at least for some students? I don't know about all, but and then I'm done.
Yeah, and we're getting a little bit outside of my expertise. Historically, we've done defensive private school, private educational choice programs, and we've done offensive litigation when it's involved, tackling barriers to those programs, like the Blaine Amendment in Espinoza, or the statutory analog of a Blaine Amendment in Carson versus Macon. So I'm speaking a little bit outside of my kind of expertise here. But I do know, Tim DeRoche has written extensively on the kind of segregative problems inherent in residential assignment within and between school districts. And I believe that there is a promising strategy to pursue there. Again, it's not something that we at Institute for Justice are focused on, but I absolutely think that there could be that could be a stronger case, at least right now, than kind of what we've been discussing prior to this, which is kind of like an offensive challenge mandating that government fund private educational opportunities. If someone can show kind of real segregative impacts in the public system and can tie that to segregative intent in some form, and there's been a lot of scholarship in recent years over the correlation between the discriminatory redlining maps of the 1930s and modern day school attendance zones, I think there might well be a very strong case to be made there. And I know that the organization that Tim founded, Available to All, is looking very seriously at pursuing those types of cases. And I think it would be a tremendous thing to remove residential assignment within the public system. Of course, I'd like to see the money follow the child wherever her parents decide is best. But removing this nefarious practice of assigning kids to schools not at all based on their needs, but simply based on the zip code they happen to live in or can afford to live in is just a horrible practice. And I would love, whether it's Tim or someone else, to crack that through litigation.
Well, thank you. And I guess I needed to clarify. I meant segregation within that school. It means that child should be able to go anywhere, private or public. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions they would like to ask? And please, if you do, unmute yourself. Oh, okay, John?
Yeah, the issue that I've pushed in a couple of my books is that we discriminate against the children for whom the assigned school is a poor fit. It seems to my naive legal mind that the obvious spending more on one child than another that is the same other than which school they attend seems like an equal protection thing. I'm not sure where the struggle is to create that legal theory, but I bet you do.
Again, outside of my expertise, I mean, if you're talking about, one of the difficulties in this area is that much of the litigation, I think, has focused on this notion that a public education is a right secured under a state constitution, and it's a positive right. So, unlike the right recognized in, say, Meyer and Pierce to direct the education of your children, that is essentially a negative right. The right to decide for yourself rather than the government to decide for you what education your child will receive. Much of the litigation concerning funding and disparities in funding within the public school system focuses on the idea that you have not a negative right to choose your child's education, but rather a positive right under the state constitution to have a state-provided education. And there's been a lot of litigation in many states concerning disparities in funding from one school district to the next that basically argues to make that positive right meaningful, there has to be more equal or equitable distribution of state funding within the public system. I think those cases have, I don't think they've yielded better results in the public school system. They've resulted in some cases, single cases lasting decades with continued judicial oversight and entanglement in a state's approach to public education. I think, I think if you're looking solely at the public school system, I do think simply allowing the money to follow the child to whatever school within the public school system that the parents deem best for that child would do much more to solve the inequities that we're talking about than the trying to litigate to secure a positive constitutional right to a particular funding level in my school as compared to yours. So that's why I think that, I do think there's something promising in the types of cases that Tim and the folks at Available to All are looking to pursue, because it's not, it's not focused at just dollars and trying to ensure that District X gets an appropriate amount of dollars compared to District Y. Rather, it's trying to ensure that the child can take their dollars to whatever public school they think is best for their kid. And I think that's a much more promising legal strategy. I think it will do more to cure some of the problems, many of the problems in the public school system, and will also kind of avoid some of the consequences of decades of judicial oversight and entanglement with public school financing and things like that, which just have not yielded the results that the people bringing these cases are trying to achieve.
Are there any other questions? Anybody?
This may be like a really way too basic take on things, but when you're talking about the type of, or what could be the basis for a legal challenge under the 14th Amendment, what about just the, states can't deprive people of life, liberty, and property without due process of law? I mean, could you just do it under that? Like, you can't compel me to send my kid to this school because you shouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, well, again, there's there are the intuitively, logically sound arguments, and then there's the kind of like legal reality. And so, part of the problem, I think, to bringing a case like that is that even in Meyer and Pierce, the court recognized the right of states to maintain certain levels of regulation dealing with education. And so I don't think you can march into court and point to, say, Meyer and Pierce due process cases and say, I've got a right to, decide, this for my child, and government, you can't tell me what to do. Even those cases recognize that there is some role for government to play. I think where there has been some success, albeit brief success, there was an interesting case, I think, out of the Sixth Circuit a couple of years ago that dealt with the Detroit public school system. And it was a challenge largely, geared or oriented around this idea that government can't deprive you of liberty without providing you something in return. So the theory in this case was that the conditions in the Detroit public school system were so deplorable, and that there was so little learning going on. I can't remember all the statistics that while government can restrict liberty, it can draft you. It can do the government can, under the law, restrict your liberty, but it has to have a justification for doing so. And typically it's providing something in return for that restriction. And the argument in this case was there's nothing being provided in return. The justification to provide an education simply isn't happening. And a panel of the Sixth Circuit, if I remember correctly, held in the plaintiffs, the students' favor, and basically said that, and again, it's been a while since I looked at this case. I think I'm summarizing it correctly, but said that, government can't do that. If it is going to restrict liberty through a compulsory attendance law, it actually has to be doing so for a purpose and making good on that purpose. And here the schools were not. But that decision was vacated by, I think, the en banc Sixth Circuit, and then for, I think, a rehearing, and then the case settled after that occurred. And so the opinion has essentially been vacated. It is not binding law anymore. But I think that was a very clever use of the idea of an unconstitutional deprivation of liberty, of due process. And the issue with that is a broader legal strategy, though, that I see, is that it was very particular to these particular schools, right? It turned on the deplorable conditions in these schools, the horrible statistics, the number of kids who couldn't read or do basic math. And I think trying to parlay that into like a broader legal strategy would be really difficult, because it's going to be so fact-bound on the conditions and the results in a particular school. I don't see that as being kind of like a a systemic approach or a broad kind of national approach that is somehow going to give families an opt-out or an out from bad public schools. But it was an interesting strategy and it worked briefly. So again, I don't purport to have any great insight into how you go from kind of the defensive posture we've been in for so long to the kind of creative offensive litigation to secure better educational options for kids. But that was, an interesting, albeit fleeting, effort. And I suspect we're going to see similar and different educational, reform litigation in the future. And I think, like I said before, it's going to be really interesting to keep an eye on that Supreme Court case, Mahmoud versus Taylor, because it really does deal at root about this, what happens when a family is compelled to attend a public school, what that public school teaches, or at least some things that it teaches, are inconsistent with kind of the deep, whether it's religious, philosophical, ideological beliefs of that family. And if a family doesn't have the resources to opt out of that situation, what is the family's recourse? And it's going to be really interesting to see what the Supreme Court does in that case. And perhaps there's going to be something in that decision that could be built upon to kind of take this next step. And we'll know by late June when the court breaks for the end of the session.
It seems like Yoder maybe would have some there too.
Just real quick, a comment on that before we move to another subject. To me, that sounds like a thread really worth pursuing, because Michael, you said that these horrible statistics. Those horrible statistics are extremely the norm. I mean, they're very common. These big city school districts where they're spending $20,000 to $30,000 per child and having almost no one that can read or do basic math. They're not outliers. That's the norm. Anyway, so I just want to throw that in there. So maybe we can build on that Sixth Circuit case, and I would appreciate if you have a link to it so we can study it. If you could maybe send that to us. Tom, I appreciate your patience, me interjecting there.
Oh, not at all. I just wanted to set Michael at ease. I'm not going to press him on these creative legal theories. He and I have had many debates and discussions about them for several months and years now. I did want to go back to some of your core points, though, Michael. I love the history of it. I love knowing about NEA's involvement. It's really terrific stuff. I want to make sure I understand kind of your broader thesis, though, because you've pointed out some of the failures, which, true enough, right? The trying to exclude religion, trying to exclude white nuns from teaching black children, trying to exclude the teaching of foreign language, all of that kind of stuff failed. And yet, sort of the big picture, when I look at the EdChoice share, you still have 75% of the students in this country go to traditional public schools. And so there's sort of a big win there for the NEA at some level. And so I want to see if I can understand. In fact, one might even argue that's why several of us on this call have jobs, right? We're trying to get away from trying to push back against that century and a half old win. So I just wanted to, I raised that only to help to give you a chance to kind of tell me again, kind of what is your kind of main point and your main thesis about NEA and what it's tried to do, where it's falling short, and what we can think, how we can think about the history as teaching us something about the present.
Yeah, I don't dispute anything you said, Tom. I mean, obviously, we're, in some ways far kind of worse off in terms of the percentage of kids being compelled to attend public schools today, failing public schools, than we were, prior to the NEA's work. So I'm not suggesting that, everything the NEA has done has backfired on them. They've, in large measure, achieved much of what they've attempted. But when it comes to legal precedent, I do think that pretty much everything they've tried to do to thwart private competition, private alternatives, has backfired. And I'm encouraged by that progression in the precedent that that I see, because each of these cases really builds upon the next. I've never seen anyone draw this connection. I wonder if it exists, though. But that, like, for example, that Florida Circuit Court decision, sounds a lot like the Supreme Court's decision 7 years later in Meyer, in talking about the economic rights of schools to provide their services to children, etc. Pierce builds on Meyer. Espinoza draws from Pierce. Like I see this, this kind of, like I said, this arc that continuously bends toward greater protection. And I think that in terms of constitutional law, that the efforts have largely or almost exclusively backfired against the public school establishment. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't translated into the kind of utopian scenario I would like to see, where the funding truly does follow the child, and there is still a lot of work to be done. But the fact that 30 years ago, it wasn't clear whether you could have a legislatively adopted private school choice program. Until 5 years ago, it wasn't clear whether states could bar religious options from those programs. And now both of those things are clear. You can have choice, it can include religion, and it cannot exclude religion. And so I just see this kind of incremental kind of march toward greater protection as a very encouraging sign. And I do think that we're not done with it. I mean, I think this particular Supreme Court, is as strong. Not this particular Supreme Court; it's the same Supreme Court that's been around for more than 200 years. But there's obviously an interest among the members of this court in protecting the rights of parents, particularly who have kind of religious concerns with things going on with respect to education. But I think these justices are equally interested in the broader rights recognized in Meyer and Pierce, the right of parents to direct not just the religious upbringing of their children, but the right to direct the education of their children, more broadly. I think of there's that case from a couple of years ago. I forget the name of it, but it's kind of referred to as the angry cheerleader case, right? Where a public school student was disciplined by her public school for tweeting something about the cheerleading coach. I forget the specifics. The court, she challenged this. The court ruled in her favor, and it was, I think, a concurring opinion, I think by Justice Gorsuch or Alito, or maybe both of them joined, that basically said, look, yeah, sure, when you send your child to a public school, you're surrendering some degree of control to that school, but you're not giving the state authority to tell your child what they can or cannot tweet about from a 7-Eleven on Saturday afternoon. And he cites, Pierce or Meyer for that proposition. And, this is, I think it was Justice Alito, and Justice Alito is not known as the justice who's most receptive to meaningful protection for unenumerated rights. And yet here he is pointing to these century-old decisions concerning the most fundamental unenumerated right, the right of parents to direct the education of their children, and citing to that for the proposition that the state does not control every aspect of your child's education. So I just see this kind of continued progression and the interest of the justices currently on the court on not just religious issues concerning education, but more broadly, the right of parents rather than the state to make those choices. I see it as really encouraging. And I do think 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to see a much different, changed landscape in education. And I don't think it's going to be just because legislators have continued adopting school choice programs. I think there are going to be judicial decisions, Supreme Court decisions that result in reforms themselves. And I just, I don't know, I don't purport to know what that's going to look like or what those cases are going to look like, but it's just a feeling that I have, and it would be consistent with that continued continuous arc of precedent that I've described.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this webinar. Just the whole idea of the arc of the precedent is something I had not thought about myself, and I really appreciate that way to think about it. I still think it's worth pushing the envelope as far as we can, but thank you so much for everything that you have taught us here today, Michael. I really do appreciate it. And thank you everyone for attending and asking great questions.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, John. And we'll see you soon.